So I want to tell you about a very powerful tool that you can use in negotiations and persuasion. It's called cognitive anchoring, and it's a little bit tricky to define, but it's kind of like an anchor on a boat, like a physical anchor. Now, much like that physical anchor, the purpose is to keep a boat tied to a certain location so that it can't drift too far either direction. Cognitive anchors kind of keep our mind anchored to a certain mindset, either a certain number or a certain mindset, and it doesn't allow us to drift too far one direction or the other, even if, based on the evidence, maybe we should. It affects, almost every aspect of our life. It can have a significant role in who you vote for, whether or not you have a romantic encounter, whether or not you get a job, whether or not you like a particular song or a particular movie or TV show the first time you're exposed to it. It can affect how much you pay for a car or a house, or how much you can get somebody else to pay for your car or your house. It affects so much of our lives. Instead of just giving you the definition, which is kind of tricky, I just want to give you an example, and we'll kind of learn what this is by going over a bunch of different examples. Okay, so let's say you are starting a new trendy restaurant. You've already hired the best cook. You've got a great location. You've got the interior, looking great. You've got all your menu items. The last thing to do is to decide what's the name of this restaurant going to be. And you've narrowed it down between either Studio 97 or Studio 17. And you're probably thinking, well, unless it's like on 17th Street or something, it probably doesn't matter whether you pick one of those two names. But you would be wrong. I want to tell you about a study. They did a study where they took, fake menus for a fake restaurant. They had a bunch of food items on it with no prices, and they gave it to people. They had them look at the menu, and then they just asked them, what's the most you'd be willing to pay for some of these menu items? The only difference is that some people on their menu at the top, it says the name of the restaurant was Studio 17. And the other ones on the top, it said this restaurant was called, Studio 17. The logo was exactly the same. Other than that, all the menu items were exactly the same. The menu looked the same. The only difference was that name, Studio 17 or Studio 97. And the study found, as it was designed to do, that people who read the menu that was titled Studio 97, they were willing to pay significantly more for those menu items, which were the exact same menu items on the menu of Studio 17. And this is because of cognitive anchoring. The people with menu to Studio 97 were thinking about large numbers. They just had large numbers on their mind. They were thinking 97. So when it came time to, how much would you be willing to pay, $18, $24, $38, they were just thinking of higher numbers. The people who had Studio 17 were just generally, their mind was subconsciously anchored to a lower number. So even in those kind of seemingly insignificant things, it can have a profound effect. All right, so we see that anchoring is very powerful when it comes to these kind of financial, transactional occurrences. So let's see how it works in a different field. How about the area of romance, which hopefully for you is neither financial nor transactional. If it is, I think you might be doing it wrong. But I want to tell you about two studies that have to do with anchoring in the unrelated category of romance. So these are actual studies that they did in the real world. They had young guys go up to girls and ask them out on dates, and they had them do it on clear sunny days and on cloudy days. And what they found is that girls were almost twice as likely to say yes to go on a date with a guy if it was a sunny day than if it was a cloudy day. And this has to do with anchoring as well. They weren't anchored to a certain big or small number. They were just anchored to a general positive mindset, of sunny days instead of kind of gloomy, cloudy days. Now, in the second study, they had a guy stand in front of different types of businesses, kind of like in a shopping center or a downtown area, And then he, as the girls walked by, he would, ask them either for their phone number or to go on a date. I think it was just for their phone number. And they found that his odds of getting them to give him their phone number was significantly affected based on what type of store he was standing in front of. So I want to ask you, what do you think was the type of store he was standing in front of when he had the best kind of odds of success about getting a girl's phone number? What do you think? So I've asked this to my face-to-face classes, and I've gotten some really good guesses. It'd be like a gym. Some people say like a bank or a jewelry store. Maybe if women were thinking, oh, maybe this guy could buy me some jewelry. But the correct answer is actually a florist, right? If when the guy was standing in front of a florist, he had the most success. And that makes sense if you think about it, because if a girl was walking by a florist, it would be more likely to remind her and put her in this mindset about, romantic encounters. Maybe she would subconsciously recall a time when she got flowers, or a time when a coworker got flowers and it made that coworker feel really special. Or maybe a romantic movie that she saw where somebody in the movie got flowers and it was a lot of romance and made them feel really special. So even in these kind of emotional, subjective areas like romance, anchoring is still very, very powerful. So we've demonstrated how anchoring is effective in business transactions. We've demonstrated how anchoring is effective in romantic encounters. And what's something that's kind of the opposite of a romantic encounter? Maybe not a fist fight, but how about politics? Politics is kind of the opposite of romance, right? And if you don't believe me, try to talk a lot of politics on your next date and it probably won't go too well. So they've also done some studies about anchoring and politics. They did one real life study and they found that when a voting location is moved from a church to a public school, it affects one party. One party gets a better outcome than the other, and then vice versa. If you take a polling location that used to be at a public school and you move it to a church, it affects the other political party, kind of gets a benefit there. So out of the two major political parties, Republicans and Democrats, which one do you think gets an advantage when the polling location is moved from a church to a public school? And then when it's moved from a public school to a church, which one do you think gets the advantage? Well, in thinking about anchoring, and you need to know a little bit about US politics for this, there's always exceptions, but generally the conservative, the right, is more associated with kind of religious, at least Christian religious movements. And the left, the Democrats, are more associated with kind of government policies such as public school. If you were to look at the statistics, highly religious people are more likely to be conservative and public school teachers are more likely to be Democrat. So when you move the location away from church to a public school, the people that go there to vote are they just got public school on their mind and maybe government goods and services. They're just thinking about those. So they're more likely to vote Democrat. There's a slight bump there. Vice versa, you go from a public school to a church, people just kind of have religious things in their mind. That's the mindset that they're anchored to. And then they're more likely to vote for a conservative. Now there's a second study done about political campaign ads. Everybody's favorite thing to see on TV and YouTube, right? Those political campaign ads. Well, on this one, what they did is they took one political campaign ad and they changed a single word. And that single word change resulted in vastly different responses from people who viewed the ad. The first version of the ad, it talked about crime and it referred to crime as a ravaging beast. It gave some statistics and it said crime is a ravaging beast, okay? And then after seeing the commercial, they asked people, well, what do you think we should do about crime? And not surprisingly, because it was put in the context of a beast, people mentioned kind of catch and cage type solutions, just like you would do if there was a literal beast. You'd want to catch it and cage it so that it couldn't harm people. So they gave solutions like, oh, we need more police and we need longer jail sentences. That's how we're going to protect, that's how we're going to contain this ravaging beast. Okay, not surprising. In the other version of the ad, it was all the same, but they just changed this one word. Instead of a ravaging beast, they called it a ravaging virus. And then they asked those people, how should we address this crime that's a ravaging virus? Now there, because they define term as a virus, which is kind of more of an unhealthy condition, people gave solutions that were more like you'd attack a virus, right? So it was kind of like, kind of containment and treatment. So they talked about things like job training, crime prevention, drug treatment, things like that. And the really interesting thing about this is that single word in that advertisement, whether crime was referred to as a ravaging beast or a ravaging virus, that single word difference produced a bigger change than the difference between political party affiliation. So the difference between Republicans and Democrats in how they say we should address crime was less severe than the difference between random people who just saw these two different ads with a single word. So if you can imagine, if you've talked to your friends, one's a big-time Republican, one's a big-time Democrat, and you may think, oh, they're so different and they see everything so differently. Well, this anchoring in this one commercial by a single word was even more powerful than the power of those two political parties that caused those differences that you've experienced. Now, it's important to note that anchoring is morally neutral. It can be used for good or evil. I want to give you an example. They did a study involving Asian women in college, and they randomly divided them into two groups, and they gave them each the same math test. But before they gave them that math test, in one group, they gave them a questionnaire with questions that had to do with their race. So it was things like, how many generations of your family have lived in America? Do you find it hard to locate ethnic foods that you like in this area? Questions that, do you ever feel discriminated against because of your Asian heritage? Questions that focused on their race. In the other group, they gave them a survey with questions that focused on their gender. Would you prefer co-ed dorms? Do you feel comfortable as a woman on this campus? Things like that. And then they gave them the exact same math test. And as expected, the group that were reminded of their Asian heritage performed far better on their math test than the group that was reminded of their female gender performed on their math test, even though it was the exact same math test and they were random groups. So this is also because of anchoring. This group was anchored to their Asian heritage. They were basically reminded, you're Asian, you're Asian, you're Asian. And there's a stereotype that Asians perform very well on math. So no doubt that they had that in their mind, so they performed accordingly. Now this other group, they were reminded, you're a woman, you're a woman, you're a woman. So they were tied down to this identity of being a woman. And there is also a stereotype, I'm not saying this is true or not, there is a stereotype that women are not as good as men at math. So they no doubt kind of had that in their subconscious. So, anchoring is a very powerful thing, but sometimes we get anchored down to these very negative notions and negative mindsets that we can't do something. So we need to anchor ourselves to, positive mindsets so that we can get positive results. Likewise, we want to be a good member of society. We don't want to go around anchoring people to bad things and make their lives, miserable. We want to anchor other people to positive things so that they have a more positive life. So if you've had me in class before, I'm the business law professor here, and I've actually used anchoring in some of my research about criminal and civil law. So for example, in one of my studies, it was a civil law case about somebody who was injured by a defective hot water heater. All that mattered was some people, they all got the same facts, And then some people, they're pretending to be jurors. They were asked by the plaintiff's attorney, I want you to give an award to my client of, I forget the numbers, it was like $1 million, okay? And other people was like, oh, give him an award of, $250,000. And in another group, it was only like $15,000. So 15,000, 250,000, and $1 million or 2 million. Okay, so a high, medium, and low. And when I got the results back of what the jurors said they would award that plaintiff, sure enough, the people who got the big request returned back higher amounts. It wasn't $1 million, but it was a lot higher than the people who got the medium request and the people who got the low request. And this is kind of anchoring at the most basic level. So the people who heard, what did I say, $15,000, I think, they were thinking of kind of lower numbers, so they gave lower numbers. The people who heard, $1 million or $2 million, they were just thinking about $1 million, and then they kind of deviated from that a little bit. So the people who heard 15, maybe they deviated up a little bit to 20,000, but the people who heard $1 million, maybe they deviated down a little bit to 800,000. But it's the difference between 20,000 and 800,000, just because one of the plaintiff's attorneys was more bold in their request. So that's anchoring. And a very similar thing happens in another study I did that had to do with request for sentencing. So if the prosecutor requests, I forget the years, but if they request, a high number of years, the judge is more likely to sentence the defendant to a long term. And if the defendant requests kind of a lower number of years, the judge is more likely to sentence to a lower term. I think the difference was almost 50% more. It was something like 40% more. So if you just happen to have a prosecutor who happens to throw out a really big number, even if the number is kind of ridiculous and doesn't really make sense, it just ties the judge to that bigger number. And finally, anchoring is so powerful that even when the anchor is obviously irrelevant, and even when it is completely absurd, it still affects people. So these are actual studies. They had like this big wheel that you would spin, and it was either rigged to land on a really low number or a really high number from 1 to 100. Okay, so you come up, you spin the wheel, you get a 7 or you get, an 85 or something. And then they ask you the question, they say, how many countries do you think are on the continent of Africa? Okay, so the correct number is 54, but most people don't know exactly what that is. And what they found is that if you get that low number, you'll give a low estimate, like, maybe 30 something. And if you get the really high number, you give a higher estimate, like in the 50s or 60s. Even though these participants, they knew that spinning this random number generator had nothing to do with how many countries were in Africa. It was completely unrelated, but it still had an effect. So even irrelevant, unrelated anchors still work. And even when the anchor is completely ridiculous, it still works, like these two examples. So you may think your textbooks for class are really expensive. Well, they did this study, and this was like 10 years ago, where they asked people, I think the first question was, one group got, do you think the cost of your textbook is more or less than, I think it was $7,100, which, I know the prices are getting up there, but we're not at $7,000 yet. So that's absurdly high. Everybody knows their textbook is not going to cost $7,000. And then the other group, they asked them, like, do you think your textbook is going to be more or less than, $65 or something, some really low number. And then they asked them, well, what do you think your textbook's going to cost? And sure enough, the people who were first asked if it's more or less than $7,100, they guessed significantly higher numbers. They knew that $7,000 number was completely irrelevant. The textbook's going to cost nowhere near $7,000, but it just put them in this framework of they're just thinking about high numbers. They had high numbers on their mind, so they gave a higher number. Similarly, they did another study where they asked people, I think this was done in San Francisco, and they said, do you think the temperature outside is more or less than 558 degrees? Okay, that was the high group. The other group, do you think it's more or less than 72 or whatever, some reasonable number? So, I know it gets pretty hot here where we are, but 558 is absurd. Everybody knows it wasn't anywhere near 558 degrees. I think it was somewhere in the 80s. But sure enough, the group that was first asked that ridiculous question of whether or not it's more or less than 558 degrees, when it came time for them to give an estimate about how hot it really was outside, they gave estimates that were slightly higher than the group that was just asked if it was more or less than 72. So throughout this presentation, I demonstrated what I claimed at the very beginning. Anchoring is incredibly powerful and it affects nearly every aspect of your life. So I want you to think a little bit. And it's hard to recall exact times that this happened to you because it's subconscious. You don't realize it's happening. But maybe think about times in your life. How come you really like this song and you really don't like that song? Or you really like this movie and you really don't like that movie? Is that really a purely objective decision? Or was it maybe when you first heard that song, you happened to be in a really good mood? And when you first heard this other song, you just happened to be in a really bad mood. Maybe you think you got a really good deal on something sometime. Maybe you really did, or maybe you just happen to be in a certain mood. You happen to just have big numbers in your mind at the time. So be thinking kind of in the past how that might have happened to you. And more importantly, be thinking moving forward, how might anchoring affect your decisions and how might you be able to use anchoring to affect the way other people view things?